Hey, now it's Brace for Impact, and I'm your host, Mike Gilbert, and I'm going solo one night ass, but it's still the same. We're talking TNA wrestling and WWE wrestling, believe it or not. Um, I know you guys, the cat's already out of the bag. Everybody already knows. Earlier this week, whenever WWE and TNA announced their formal partnership, meaning they have signed a deal to become full-blown partners, talent exchanges, all kinds of stuff. I immediately went to the YouTube because I was just in my car. So I immediately went to the YouTube and I did like 20 some odd minutes with a quick reaction. I have a couple of I've had a couple of days to digest the information, so we'll talk about that. And not much has changed on my end as far as what I think about it. So but we'll go ahead and talk about that. I want the chat to go off. I want to hear what you guys got to say. Now that we've been a couple of days removed from the big announcement that yes, WWE and TNA have announced a formal partnership. They have entered into a formal agreement to exchange talent for TNA and NXT, and they are and that's going to be starting this coming up tomorrow on TNA Genesis. And in fact, the NXT Twitter account just promoted TNA Genesis, like it just happened a few minutes ago. And that's not something that they've done before. Like before they got this agreement on paper, which I think this is probably a part of the agreement. I think that's a reasonable assumption that part of the agreement is the WWE is going to help promote some of these TNA shows. By promote, I mean like advertising on their platforms, on their TV show, which they did. They plugged it on Tuesday night too on NXT. And then they advertised it again this morning, or at least this afternoon for the rest of you, this morning for me, on their social media. I get the feeling we'll get another plug tomorrow, and we will definitely be seeing some NXT talent on Genesis tomorrow. A swig of coffee for WWE and TNA, I guess. All right. But you guys know that I am a historian of pro wrestling. I am not like Dave Meltzer level. I'm not even JD Oliva level, but I've been studying pro wrestling my whole life, right? And I love reading about the history of pro wrestling. I've read several books about the history of wrestling. I've watched all the documentaries. I listened to all the podcasts. It just interests me. And so because of that, I have a little bit of pessimism to me. Now with this partnership announcement, I said it on when it came out on Thursday, that I think that everybody on the TNA side should be cautiously optimistic. And what do I mean by that? WWE has a 40-year history of working with partners, a lot of those partners being lower level partners, right? They've rarely ever worked with co-equals. Like they never worked with WCW, right? They never worked with anybody that was on the same level as them. They've only ever worked with people that were beneath them. Is because they've typically been on top, right? And anybody that kind of threatens that, they try to go out of the way to destroy. But with the partners that are, smaller than they are, that don't have as much money, that have a less of a footprint, anytime they've helped them, they've not actually helped, right? In the end, those companies end up going away. And I made I did gather a little bit of a list here. I was gonna write a story for it on Patreon, and so we'll see. I think it actually comes across better when you see it in writing. But they in the 80s, they had this television show called All Star Wrestling, right? That was the main WWF show, and then Vince Jr. took over, then it became WWF, and they had a time slot on USA Network that was long before Raw, and there for a time, Vince, it was kind of like a wraparound show where Vince was actually the host with Lord Alfred Hayes, and like he would have different territories sending them tapes of their top stars. He's like, hey, look, I got this national time slot. Why don't you go ahead and send me tapes of your stars, and I will air them on our show, and I will get you guys some exposure, right? So you started seeing like AWA would send tapes of, Hulk Hogan and Jesse Ventura and some of their talent. And Mid-South was sending tapes, Florida was sending tapes, and the list goes on, right? Like he was getting tapes from World Class, getting tapes from Southwest Championship Wrestling out of San Antonio, right? Just all these places. And the next thing you know, one by one, a lot of those stars ended up getting signed by WWF. And then Vince went into those territories, bought them out, and put them out of business. Right? It just continued to happen. AWA lasted a little while longer. WCCW lasted a little, like Texas lasted a little bit longer. But in fact, in Texas, they actually like worked together a little bit in '86. They and then that went nowhere. Houston Wrestling, they worked with Paul Bosch for a little bit, and then sure enough, they took over that territory. Paul Bosch went out of business. He retired. Maple Leaf Wrestling out of Toronto, not the same one that Scott D'Amore has, although that's what he's trying to recreate. They were their Canadian partner, and then ultimately Vince bought them out, put them out of business. ECW in the 90s. They actually had a working arrangement where they were sending talent to ECW that they were having trouble getting over, guys like Al Snow and Just Incredible, and then they sent a few more stars down there. Jerry Lawler ended up working there for a little bit as part of like a talent exchange. Rob Van Dam and Sabu and Taz came over to the WWF and worked a little bit. And but it led to nothing for ECW. Eventually WWF ended up getting ECW's time slot. We're seeing a pattern here on TNN back in the day, the Nashville network. It was the Nashville network, then it went to the national network. That's when ECW was on. And then when WWF came in and took over, and they didn't want ECW on the network, and then ECW gets kicked off of the network, and now they're left looking for a new partner. They end up going out of business, right? And then all of a sudden TNN becomes Spike TV, and then the rest is history. Smoky Mountain Wrestling. There was a talent exchange there because Jim Cornette worked for WWF in the creative offices. And so in 1993, from 93 to like 95, they started sending talent back and forth. Randy Savage actually went and worked there. Shawn Michaels went and worked a program with Buddy Landel. The Rock and Roll Express came to the WWF for a little bit. Eventually that went nowhere. And then of course that company went out of business. Now, a lot of people will point to the fact that these companies went out of business for a lot of reasons. And that is true. ECW was horribly mismanaged by Paul Heyman, right? He just, they got too big and did not have the infrastructure in place to be able to keep up with that growth. And despite the fact that they were selling tickets, they couldn't get any money from television. And then ultimately they had to go out of business. Smoky Mountain Wrestling was Jim Cornette's promotion that he owned, but it was being funded by Rick Rubin. They weren't able to get enough money, and the Gangstas came in and they were super controversial. And the money ended up getting pulled, and then that company goes out of business. But those are just more examples of companies, smaller companies that WWF has worked with that went out of business. And then, of course, you got the fall of British wrestling, where WWE went into Europe, all over Europe, and partnered up with a lot of those companies and brought over their talent. And we're going to do talent exchanges. They're going to platform these companies. And then one by one, a lot of those companies started to fall, or they were never the same again, right? Now, people will say that a big part of that was speaking out, and that is true. COVID-19 absolutely was definitely hurt. But WWE going in there and creating NXT UK absolutely helped wipe out that scene. And they went in there because World of Sport had gotten themselves, I want to say on ITV, and it became like, it was supposed to become this big thing, a funded thing, and it never got off the ground because WWE actively went in there and sabotaged it. Okay. Now, I know what other people are going to say. Bad man gone, right? Vince McMahon is gone. It's a new day. Yes, it is. It's a new day. The bad guy is gone. Well, let me tell you, the guy that led the charge for NXT UK to help, that ultimately ended up, even if they didn't mean to, or even if it wasn't intentional, that's just what happened. Even if it didn't mean to, was Paul Levesque, Triple HGH, with help from Steven Regal, and of course Pete Dunne was like a double agent. Billy makes a good point. Evolve also, yeah, Evolve, right? Brought in Gabe Sapolsky. Evolve was going to be kind of like their WWE ID system. Evolve ends up going out of business because WWE just pulled the talent up to their roster and kind of just shut it down, right? Evolve even had on the WWE network like a live event, right? And you would think, oh, this is so cool. WWE's putting on indie shows on their channel, but it didn't do them any favors. Okay, so I feel like everybody should understand the history of WWE's partnerships and how none of the companies have ever been better coming out of it. Could this be different? I think that TNA is better managed, has better funding, corporate backing, has its own distribution, and it is on far more solid ground than all of those other promotions. So even if and when this partnership goes south, I think that because I think that it's a real possibility that WWE is going to end up every top star this company has as soon as their contracts are done that they're going to pick the bones clean, right? They're going to introduce these stars on their channels and then they're going to pick the bones clean. I don't think TNA is going to go out of business because of this, right? I think that they're too well managed at this point. Anthem believes in the product a lot, and it is the primary asset for this company. And I think that we should, like I said, cautious optimism. So I told you why we should be cautious. If you don't learn from history, you are doomed to repeat it. So I think it is okay to be optimistic about this partnership. I think a lot of good things can come from this partnership, and I'm going to explain what those good things are. But I also think you should know the history before you go into it with such optimism, okay? A lot of those companies that WWE partnered up with, like I said, there were a ton of reasons why those companies went out of business. And a lot of it was just because they were poorly mismanaged and they were ran by people that did not know what they were doing, right? And I think it seems to me that Anthem has been at this long enough now. They've owned this company since 2017, and they have went through the fire with this company, and they've stripped it down to its studs in 2018. They've gone through different management, and I feel like right now they're on the most solid footing that they've ever been on. Okay. So I think that's why there is case for some optimism, because I just think that Anthem believes in TNA. Okay. I also think that WWE likes TNA being in the tent pissing out as opposed to being outside the tent pissing in. And I think that WWE would like to be able to use TNA as a way to block AEW's growth. Okay. I don't think that there's ever going to be a world that we're living in where TNA surpasses AEW as the number 2 promotion. Anybody that's actively saying that right now is being disingenuous. They're lying, they're grifters, and they're just not they're not good people if they say that. Okay, because they know the truth, and the truth is, unless TNA is getting themselves $200 million a year and doing over 100,000 pay-per-views and can sell out arenas over 10,000 for their biggest shows, and then they can do a Wembley Stadium show, until they can do that, and then surpass AEW in all the ratings, the metrics, they're not even fucking close, right? So anybody that's saying that is actively lying to their audience. That's called grifting. When you're purposely lying to the audience to get clicks, to get views, to get social engagement, you're a liar and you're not a good person. Okay. So I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that AEW's market share is dwindling because of their popularity is going down. And if WWE helps boost up and prop up TNA, they can then eat away at AEW's market share. Not to a certain point where they take over AEW, but it would then make the gap between AEW and WWE even further. Okay. And it would lessen the competition from their biggest competitor, which is AEW. Okay. WWE does not see TNA as a threat. They just kind of like having them. I think TNA is ultimately, yes, they're going to be partners. They're going to be friends. They're going to be homies. But I think that they're like, well, you're going to say, what is WWE getting out of this? They're getting a lot of things out of this. Ultimately, they're going to get NXT stars that need more reps onto TNA, and that's going to be beneficial. They're going to be able to bring TNA stars over to NXT, and that has created some buzz for their programming. And that has been a fun thing for them to do. It creates more unpredictability. You never know who's going to show up. I think that makes the television show more interesting. A lot of the people on that show are super green. They're not ready for prime time yet. So TNA has a lot of stars that have been around for a long time that they can help mix in. And that would be beneficial to the talent that they ultimately want to get over. What does this also do? When TNA gets a talent super over, super hot, like they were able to do with Jordan Grace and Joe Hendry, ultimately they're going to be able to have the kind of first right of refusal to be able to sign those talents. Okay, so I think that boom, boom, boom. I named off 3 benefits without even thinking about it, and then another big benefit: propping up TNA takes away from AEW. It does. I fully believe the WWE helped TNA get that Sportsnet 360 deal. And they did it as a way to block AEW from getting that deal, because if AEW got it, then they would be on the #1 sports network in all of Canada. But WWE, I'm pretty sure, helped them get that. And I talked to a guy that knows Canadian TV, and he said, yeah, he thinks that's the case. I think WWE is going to help TNA get Sony 10 in India. They might not get it, but I think WWE is going to actively help them. And this signed formal agreement will help send signals to those prospective networks that yes, you can get premium content with some WWE stars for a promotion that WWE supports, not supports in like financially, but supports as like, hey, we're friends, right? Like we have these guys' backs, and you're going to get some WWE talent on the show. And you're not going to have to spend a lot of money for it, as opposed to spending tons of money for AEW. You can get this at a fraction of the price, and WWE will have your back, right? So I think that's going to ultimately add up to that India deal, and I think it's eventually going to add up to TNA getting a U.S. distribution deal. Where that is, I don't know, but there's a lot of prospects out there. There's a lot. I think there's if WWE wanted to create 6 more shows for networks, I think networks would buy them, right? But they don't want to do that. So they could prop up TNA to get on one of these networks and have it eat it away at AEW's market share. They're oversaturating the market and going to take AEW down a couple pegs. And so I think ultimately, if this deal leads to TNA getting distribution, they got distribution in Canada. If they get distribution and a bigger distribution in India, and then a bigger distribution deal in the US, this is a fucking home run for TNA. Not only that, I think this Genesis pay-per-view is probably going to outsell Bound for Glory and Slammiversary. I don't think it's going to outsell Hard to Kill last year, but I think it's going to outsell the latest 2 because of the buzz surrounding it. I think that the ticket sales right now, we're getting close to a sellout on the floor, and those are really high-priced seats. I think we get really close to pushing past 3,000 tickets in that Curtis Caldwell Center, which kind of blows away what AEW and Ring of Honor had done recently, right? And then we start this. Then as we look ahead, we go into Rebellion and the Galen Center. Like we're gonna do probably pretty big numbers there, and then fast forward to Slammiversary, we're talking the biggest gate in TNA history. So that's why there's a reason for a ton of optimism, and I think TNA fans should be optimistic about this. Just know the history. Okay. All right. So I went doom and gloom, but then boom, positive sandwich approach. That's old school military leadership. So let's go to the chat. Let's see what the chat thinks about this. Let's see. Josh Sloan, great to finally catch a live episode. Yeah, I typically do this really early while the family's asleep, so that way I'm not taking away from family time on a Saturday. But family needed to sleep in. I had to watch the baby, so here we are. We're a couple hours late. But thank you for joining us, sir. Billy said, I liked her analysis. You always have to be cautious when dealing with her. By her, I assume me, and I am all man, brother. See Evolve UK Indies, but it's working so far. Yeah, so the only evidence that we have right now about this specific relationship is that it's all positive, that there have been no negatives. Okay, so I think that's a good thing. I think that has to be factored into when we provide analysis on this topic. Dr. Dre said, just need TNA to be TNA, man. Need some TNA flavor back, some actual TNA legends. They deserve a last shot in the limelight during their resurgence. I agree. I think it is time for James Storm to come back. I think it is time for crazy ass matches, steel cage matches, lethal lockdown, King of the Mountain. Like, now is the time for TNA to say, let's fucking go. Let's go for it. We got to be all in now. And I think that they are. I was on a podcast with this cat named Warren Hayes, great guy, but he's not like super into TNA. He doesn't really. So he brought me on to kind of talk about TNA's outlook for 2025. And he asked the question, and I was like, in my head, I was just like, this is not a good question. But like, I got why he was asking the question, because it's just kind of like a common theme around people that don't really study TNA's business the way that I study their business. He said, with TNA kind of cutting some of the contracts, which we would say here trimming the fat, but like the word out in like casual land is that they're slashing their talent budget, which is not true. But that's the way that it was being portrayed. And he goes, could they be propping themselves up for a sale? And would that sale be to the WWE? And I had to kind of cut him off, and I was just like, well, here, let me provide you a counterpoint to that. It's like, what would WWE even want to buy TNA for? There's no reason. There's no reason to buy TNA if you're WWE. You have the largest company in the world. You don't need to buy TNA to shut it down. They're no threat, right? Their tape library is no longer valuable to them because they don't have their own network, and Netflix isn't going to want it. In fact, Netflix probably isn't even going to be bringing a lot of the WCW and ECW library over. They're only interested in the WWE. So there's no real reason to have it. That's why they started that WWE Vault channel. So there's no reason for WWE to buy this thing. I don't think that they're propping up TNA to sell. In fact, I think they're propping up TNA to get a distribution deal. I think that's what this is all about.